After their marriage, Alexander and Elaiza settled into a modest home, a small but cozy space that represented everything they had dreamed of. Despite the challenges they faced, they were happy, and that happiness was enough. Alexander, once abandoned by his former lover, Melanie, and cast aside for his lack of wealth, found solace in Elaiza's unwavering love and support. Elaiza, on the other hand, had always secretly admired Alexander from afar, and after Melanie's betrayal, she took the opportunity to stand by his side, nursing his broken heart and quietly falling for him in return. Alexander, although a man of humble means, took great pride in his work. As a construction worker, he was used to hard labor and long hours. He didn't mind that his hands were rough or that his clothes were often stained with dust and sweat. In his mind, he was doing an honorable job, one that allowed him to stand tall despite his lack of wealth. He wasn't ashamed of his occupation, unlike others who looked down on him for his working-class status. All he wanted was to make enough money to build a future for himself and Elaiza. Elaiza, sweet and supportive, had been by his side since the painful breakup with Melanie. She knew the man she married wasn't perfect, but she loved him deeply. Even though they had very little material wealth, their bond was rich with affection. Every day, they cherished the small things, like the moments they shared over breakfast or the simple conversations that felt like a warm embrace. Elaiza was grateful for the life they had, but deep down, she couldn't help but wonder what their future would hold. One morning, as they sat down to their humble breakfast, Alexander spoke excitedly about the future. His words were hopeful, and his dreams filled the air as they shared the meal. "You know, love," he said with a smile, "I can't wait to see what our life will be like when we have children. Can you imagine it? A little one running around, making our house feel even more like home?" Elaiza smiled warmly, her heart swelling with love. "Soon, love. I'm sure soon we'll have everything we need. We have each other, and that's what matters most." As they continued talking about their plans for the future, Elaiza couldn't help but feel a sense of unease about what lay ahead. She loved Alexander more than anything, and although their life wasn't perfect, she had hoped they could build a future together from the ground up. But deep down, Elaiza knew that Alexander's past, his relationship with Melanie, was still a wound that hadn't fully healed. She could sense that Alexander, despite being with her now, wasn't entirely over the betrayal. The memories of Melanie's abandonment haunted him. Just as Elaiza tried to put those thoughts aside, a knock on the door interrupted their peaceful morning. Two strangers stood at the doorstep when Elaiza opened it. Both were well-dressed and exuded an air of wealth and importance, something Elaiza wasn't accustomed to. One man stepped forward and asked, "Good day. Is this the house of Alexander Pardillo, the son of Rowena Pardillo?" Elaiza's heart skipped a beat as she looked back at the strangers. "Yes, this is his home. I'm Elaiza, his wife. Is there something I can help you with?" The man smiled, but it was a cold, businesslike smile. "We're looking for Mr. Alexander. We've been sent by his father, Don Ramon Saavedra. He has returned from America and is looking for his son. It seems we've finally tracked him down." Elaiza froze, a rush of confusion and disbelief sweeping over her. "His father?" she repeated, unsure if she had heard correctly. "What do you mean? Alexander never mentioned his father." The man continued, "It's true. Your husband is the heir to a fortune, the only son of Don Ramon Saavedra, the head of a very wealthy family. It seems your husband doesn't know much about his father's side, but we've been instructed to bring him to his father. His father is a powerful man, and now that he's returned, he wants to acknowledge his son." Elaiza couldn't process the information fast enough. She had always known Alexander came from humble beginnings, but she never imagined he could be the heir to a massive fortune. Her mind raced as she thought about the implications of this revelation. The man added, "Don Ramon is a billionaire, and he's been searching for his son for years. Your husband is the legitimate heir to the Saavedra family fortune. We need to speak with him as soon as possible." Elaiza was left speechless as the two men left. She stood there for a moment, processing what she had just learned. Her husband, Alexander, was not just a simple construction worker. He was the son of a billionaire. She had no idea how to feel about it, But one thing was certain: her life with Alexander was about to change forever. The next day, Elaiza made her way to the construction site where Alexander worked. She was nervous, unsure of how to deliver the news to him. She didn't want to overreact, but the truth was overwhelming. She had spent her entire life with Alexander, thinking they were just two ordinary people trying to build a life together. Now, everything had changed. As Elaiza entered the site, she saw Alexander hard at work, his face covered in dust, and his hands gripping the tools with precision. He was in his element, surrounded by his co-workers. They all seemed to respect him, but she could still see a hint of sadness in his eyes whenever they talked about his past. He never mentioned Melanie, but Elaiza knew it hurt him every time they spoke of her. "Hey, love," Elaiza called out, making her way through the bustling site. Alexander looked up and smiled, but when he saw her expression, his smile faded. "Elaiza, what's wrong? You look pale." Elaiza took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Alexander, we need to talk. It's about your father." Alexander's eyes widened in shock. "My father? What are you talking about?" Elaiza took his hand and led him away from the noise of the construction site. "I met two men today. They said they were sent by Don Ramon Saavedra, your father. He's been looking for you, Alexander. He's returned from America, and he's a billionaire." Alexander shook his head, disbelieving. "This is crazy. I have no father. My mother raised me alone, and I've never heard of this man." Elaiza's heart ached as she watched the confusion and disbelief wash over his face. She didn't know how to make him believe her, but she knew this was true. The strangers had given her all the information she needed. "Please, Alexander, Don Ramon is looking for you. He wants to meet you. You're the heir to his fortune," Elaiza pleaded. Alexander stepped back, his mind racing. "I don't know what to think, Elaiza. This is too much. I've spent my whole life without him. I don't know how to feel about this." Elaiza took a step toward him, her voice soft and comforting. "You don't have to decide right now, but I think you should meet him. At least hear him out. We don't know what this means for us, but it's a part of your past. And maybe, just maybe, it will give us a future." Alexander stood silently for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll go, but I don't know what I'm walking into." The next day, Alexander and Elaiza made their way to the address the men had given them. They were led to a luxurious mansion, an imposing structure that felt foreign and intimidating to Alexander. Elaiza held his hand tightly as they walked through the grand gates. She could feel his nerves, and her own anxiety mirrored his. When they arrived at the front door, they were greeted by the same men who had visited their home. They led them inside, where Alexander was introduced to Don Ramon Saavedra, the man who claimed to be his father. Don Ramon was an imposing figure, tall, strong, and sharply dressed. His presence alone seemed to command respect. When he looked at Alexander, his eyes softened for a moment before he extended a hand. "Alexander," Don Ramon said, his voice deep and powerful, "I've waited a long time to meet you." Alexander hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. "I don't know what to say. I've never known you. Why now? Why didn't you come sooner?" Don Ramon's gaze darkened, and he sighed. "There were circumstances beyond my control, my son. But I've come now, and I'm here to make up for lost time. I want to give you everything you deserve." Elaiza watched the interaction from a distance, her heart heavy. She could see that Alexander was torn between the life he had built and the new reality that was unfolding before him. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same. The news of Alexander's true heritage left both him and Elaiza in a whirlwind of confusion. Although he had always known the truth about his humble origins, learning that he was the heir to a vast fortune felt like a betrayal of his hard-earned identity. How could someone like him, who had spent years working in construction and living with nothing more than his dreams and ambitions, suddenly belong to a world of wealth and power? As days passed, the tension between Alexander and Elaiza grew. Although Elaiza had supported him through everything, even when he was at his lowest, she could sense his internal struggle. She tried to comfort him, to help him make sense of this newfound reality, but her own fears began to creep in. Would Alexander change now that he had learned the truth? Would he want more than what they had built together? Elaiza couldn't shake the nagging fear that she was losing him, even though they were still together. She could see the way Alexander's demeanor had subtly shifted. His hands, once so rough and worn from a life of labor, now looked softer, more polished. He started to spend more time at the Saavedra estate, meeting with lawyers and business associates, as Don Ramon introduced him to a world that was both fascinating and intimidating. Elaiza, unsure of her place in this new life, found herself struggling to adjust. Every time she saw him leaving for meetings or speaking with his father's associates, her heart ached. She had never imagined her life with Alexander would take such a turn. In all the years they had spent together, she had never expected their relationship to be tested in this way. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where Alexander had been distracted by his phone, Elaiza found herself alone in their small home, her mind racing with thoughts of their future. What if he leaves me for this new life? She couldn't stop herself from wondering. The wealth, the power, the legacy that awaited Alexander. Was that enough to pull him away from the life they had built together? She closed her eyes and remembered the quiet moments they had shared before all this began. She longed for those simpler days, when the only thing that mattered was their love for one another. The following days were a blur of uncertainty. Alexander continued to split his time between the Saavedra estate and his construction work, but it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to juggle both worlds. His connection to Don Ramon and the Saavedra family was undeniable now, and the pressure to step into his rightful place as the heir weighed heavily on him. Elaiza watched from the sidelines, feeling more and more like a stranger in her own life. She couldn't help but feel like an outsider to this world of opulence and influence that Alexander had been thrust into. While he spent his days at the estate, she returned to the small, humble home they had shared, surrounded by memories of their life before everything changed. One afternoon, as Elaiza was cleaning their small garden, a car pulled up in front of their house. The same men who had visited her before, sent by Don Ramon, stepped out. They had come to speak with Alexander, but when they saw Elaiza alone, they decided to approach her instead. Mrs. Pardillo, one of the men said with a polite but distant smile, "We need to speak with your husband. He is required at the estate immediately." Elaiza felt a pang in her chest as she nodded. "He's not here right now. He's at work." The man glanced at the house and then back at her. "We understand, Mrs. Pardillo, but it is important that he come to the estate as soon as possible. Don Ramon insists that he begin his training to take over the family business." Elaiza nodded silently, feeling a growing sense of dread. She was no longer a part of the world that Alexander was now entering. It was clear that he was being groomed for something far beyond their humble life together. "I'll let him know," she replied quietly. While Elaiza struggled with the uncertainty of her relationship with Alexander, fate had its own plans. A week later, while she was out grocery shopping, she ran into none other than Melanie, her former best friend and Alexander's ex-girlfriend. Melanie, now looking more polished than ever, had a triumphant air about her, as though she had always known she would find herself in a world of wealth and luxury. Elaiza's heart sank when she saw Melanie's smug smile, but she didn't show it. She had always tried to remain composed in front of her, but this time, her emotions got the better of her. Well, if it isn't Elaiza," Melanie said in a mocking tone. "I see you've still managed to cling to Alexander. How's the poor construction worker? I suppose you've gotten used to living in that tiny little house, haven't you?" Elaiza stiffened, her grip tightening on the shopping bags. "You don't have the right to speak to me like that, Melanie." Melanie laughed, her eyes glinting with amusement. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Elaiza. You and I both know how this story ends. You're just the consolation prize, aren't you? When Alexander couldn't have me, he settled for you. How does that feel?" Elaiza took a deep breath, her voice steady but laced with anger. "Alexander never settled for me, Melanie. He loves me, something you wouldn't understand. He's over you." Melanie's smile faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. Is that so? Well, I wouldn't be so sure about that. I hear he's been spending a lot of time with my family lately. I don't know if you know this, but my father is quite close to Don Ramon. Perhaps they're rekindling something? Elaiza's stomach churned. What do you mean? Melanie leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. I'm just saying, don't get too comfortable. Alexander may be the heir to a fortune now, but that doesn't mean he'll want to stay with someone like you. Elaiza stood frozen, the words hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. She could feel her world starting to unravel once more, but this time, it wasn't just the past coming back. It was Melanie, ever the manipulator, trying to worm her way back into Alexander's life. Don't ever come near me again, Melanie, Elaiza said firmly, her voice trembling with both anger and fear. You're not welcome here. Elaiza couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered after her encounter with Melanie. The words her former best friend had said echoed in her mind, each one more biting than the last. She couldn't ignore the reality that Alexander, now part of a wealthy family, was being pulled into a world that she could never truly be a part of. Despite her efforts to push away her fears, it became harder each day to ignore the growing distance between her and Alexander. He had changed, or perhaps he had always been this way, buried beneath the surface. The man she married, the man who worked tirelessly for a future together, was slowly being replaced by someone unrecognizable. And Elaiza couldn't help but wonder if this change had something to do with his newfound wealth and the power it brought. Alexander was no longer the humble construction worker who would sit with her after work, talking about their dreams of building a future together. Instead, he had become distant, preoccupied with business meetings and the expectations of his father's legacy. It was as though the life they had built together had been swept away by the current of wealth and ambition that surrounded him now. One evening, when Alexander came home late from a meeting with Don Ramon's associates, Elaiza confronted him. She had been holding her concerns in for weeks, but now, with Melanie's words haunting her, she couldn't stay silent any longer. Alexander, we need to talk, Elaiza said softly, her voice trembling slightly. He looked at her with a mixture of exhaustion and frustration. Elaiza, not now. I'm tired. I've had a long day, and… No, she interrupted, her voice shaking with emotion. I can't keep pretending everything is okay. You've been so distant lately. What's happening to us? Alexander's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Elaiza saw a flicker of the man she had married. But it quickly faded, replaced by the cold mask of the heir to the Saavedra fortune. Elaiza, you knew this was coming. Things are changing. I'm changing. I have responsibilities now. You have to understand that. Elaiza's heart dropped. I understand that you're changing, but what about us? What about the life we had before all of this? I married you, Alexander. Not this man who belongs to a world I don't even recognize anymore. His gaze faltered, and for a second, Elaiza thought he might say something to reassure her, but instead, he turned away, his back to her as he spoke. I don't have time for this, Elaiza. I'm doing what I have to do. You'll have to accept it, because nothing is going to change. Elaiza felt the sting of his words as if they were a slap to her soul. She wanted to scream, to beg him to remember the love they once shared, but she knew deep down that he was already slipping away from her, lost to a world that no longer included her. The next few days passed in a blur of emotional turmoil for Elaiza. She tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the tension between her and Alexander was palpable. As much as she wanted to ignore the growing chasm between them, it was impossible to ignore the fact that the world was changing rapidly, and she was being left behind. One afternoon, while Elaiza was out shopping for groceries, she ran into someone she never expected to see again. Don Ramon's wife, Aurora. Aurora had always been kind to Elaiza, but something about her presence in this moment unsettled Elaiza. She had heard whispers about Aurora's jealousy toward her, and the way she carried herself now, more poised and elegant than ever, made Elaiza wonder if there was more to her than met the eye. Elaiza, Aurora greeted her with a sweet smile, though Elaiza could detect a hint of something else beneath the surface. It's been a while, hasn't it?" Elaiza forced a smile, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Yes, it has. How have you been?" "I've been well," Aurora replied, her eyes glinting with a subtle knowing. "But I'm curious about something. How is Alexander doing? I know he's been spending a lot of time with my husband lately, and I wanted to make sure everything is going well for him." Eliza's stomach tightened at the mention of Alexander's name. He's been busy. You know how it is." Aurora's smile didn't waver, but Elaiza could sense the underlying tension. Of course. He's destined for greatness, after all. A future that we all know will be filled with opportunities. Eliza's mind raced. Opportunities? What did she mean by that? Aurora's next words confirmed Eliza's fears. "I'm sure it must be difficult, adjusting to all these changes. But don't worry, dear. Everything will work out for the best. Alexander is a smart man. He'll make the right decisions." Elaiza didn't know what to say. The words hung in the air like a threat, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Aurora was subtly reminding her of her place. As much as she tried to remain composed, a cold knot of fear settled in her chest. What is she trying to tell me? Before Elaiza could respond, Aurora excused herself with a practiced smile, leaving Elaiza standing there, her heart heavy with doubt and unease. As Elaiza continued to struggle with her feelings of alienation, Alexander's return home grew increasingly rare. He spent more and more time at the Saavedra estate, and each time he came home, there was an air of detachment that hung between them. One evening, as she sat alone in their small house, Elaiza received an unexpected visitor. It was a man she had never met before, someone who appeared to be an associate of Don Ramon's. His sharp suit and confident demeanor contrasted with the modest surroundings of their home. "Mrs. Pardillo?" the man greeted her with a polite but formal nod. "I'm here on behalf of Don Ramon Saavedra. He requests your presence at the estate. It's urgent." Elaiza felt a mixture of confusion and fear. What could Don Ramon possibly want with her? She had always thought she was an outsider in this world of wealth and power, and now it seemed that she was being dragged deeper into it. "I don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "Why does Don Ramon want to see me?" The man's expression softened ever so slightly. "I'm afraid I can't provide details, ma'am. All I can say is that it's important. I suggest you come with me." Elaiza stood frozen in the doorway as the man continued to look at her with a polite but urgent expression. The invitation to Don Ramon's estate was unexpected, and it was clear from the man's demeanor that it was something important. Her heart raced with uncertainty, and a feeling of dread crept into her chest. She wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever awaited her at the estate, but it seemed like there was no turning back now. I'll go," Elaiza said finally, her voice a bit shaky but resolute. She grabbed her coat, trying to mask the wave of anxiety that washed over her. Her mind was racing with questions. Why would Don Ramon want to see her? Was it about Alexander? What did he want from her? She could feel a sense of foreboding gathering inside her as she followed the man to the waiting car. The drive to the Saavedra estate was long and uncomfortable, the silence between Elaiza and the man in the car almost suffocating. Elaiza couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The estate loomed ahead, its grand gates and towering walls a stark reminder of the world she was no longer a part of, a world that seemed so foreign to her now. When they arrived, Elaiza was escorted inside the lavish mansion. The halls were adorned with expensive art and fine furniture, the kind of wealth that made her feel small and insignificant. She couldn't help but feel out of place as she walked through the grandiose rooms, her footsteps echoing through the empty space. Finally, they reached a large study, where Don Ramon sat behind a massive desk, his stern face softened only by the presence of a few close associates. He looked up when she entered, his eyes scanning her as though trying to place her within the new dynamics of his life. "Elaiza," Don Ramon said, his voice deep and commanding, "I'm glad you could make it." Elaiza didn't know how to respond. She had expected to feel nervous or intimidated, but instead, a strange sense of calm washed over her. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something about Don Ramon's presence that both unnerved and intrigued her. I'm not sure why I'm here," Elaiza admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is this about Alexander?" Don Ramon studied her carefully, his gaze piercing. After a long pause, he spoke. "Yes, it is about Alexander, but it's more complicated than you might think." Elaiza's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Don Ramon leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "Alexander is not just any ordinary man. He is the heir to the Saavedra fortune. The legacy of my family has been passed down through generations, and Alexander is the one who will inherit everything. That's why I brought you here today." Elaiza felt the blood drain from her face. "What does this have to do with me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Don Ramon's expression softened slightly, though there was still a hint of seriousness in his eyes. "It has everything to do with you. You're his wife, Elaiza, and as his wife, you will play a significant role in the future of the Saavedra family. Whether you like it or not, your lives are now intertwined with mine." Elaiza felt a surge of confusion and disbelief. What is he saying? What future is he talking about? Elaiza left the Saavedra estate feeling more unsettled than ever. The conversation with Don Ramon had only raised more questions in her mind. She had always known there was something more to Alexander's past, but she never imagined it was tied to a fortune of this magnitude. And now, it seemed that her own future was tied to it as well. As the days passed, Elaiza couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a world that was not her own. The more she thought about Don Ramon's words, the more she realized how little she actually knew about the man she had married. Alexander's sudden rise in status, the mysterious disappearance of his real father, and the sudden appearance of wealthy figures, all of it seemed to be leading to something much bigger than Elaiza had ever imagined. Meanwhile, Alexander's behavior continued to change. He was distant, consumed by the responsibilities of his newfound position. He spent more time at the Saavedra estate, meeting with important people, discussing business deals, and preparing for the future. Elaiza could feel him slipping further away from her with each passing day, and it broke her heart. She had always supported him, loved him, but now, it seemed like there was no place for her in his new life. One evening, Elaiza decided to confront him. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine. The distance between them had become too wide, too painful to ignore. "Alexander," she said softly as he walked in, his briefcase in hand, "we need to talk." He didn't even look up from his papers. "Not now, Elaiza. I've had a long day, and I'm tired." Elaiza took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "No, we're talking now. You've been avoiding me, and I need to know what's going on." Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes cold and distant. "Elaiza, please. I'm doing what I have to do. You should understand that." "Understand?" Elaiza's voice trembled with emotion. "I understand that you're changing, that you're becoming someone else. I'm not stupid, Alexander. You're not the same man I married." He stood there in silence for a moment, his jaw clenched tightly. "I don't have a choice, Elaiza. This is my reality now. This is my life, and you're either with me or you're not." Elaiza felt the sting of his words deep in her heart. "This is your life, but what about me? What about us?" "Fine," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "But I don't know how much longer I can pretend that I'm okay with this." Days passed, and the strain between Elaiza and Alexander only grew. She couldn't bear the silence that filled their home, nor could she ignore the way his attention seemed to drift further and further away from her. Every moment they spent together felt like a reminder of what they had lost. One night, as Elaiza sat in their bedroom, staring out the window at the distant lights of the city, she heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. It was late, and she wasn't expecting anyone. When the door opened, she turned around to find Alexander standing there, his face pale and strained. "Elaiza," he began, his voice low, "I need to tell you something." Elaiza's heart skipped a beat. "What now?" "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found something," he said, his gaze intense, "something that could change everything." Elaiza's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Alexander walked towards her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. I found out who my real father is. And Elaiza, it's not who I thought it was. Elaiza's mind raced. Who could it be? Alexander took a deep breath. My father is Don Ramon Saavedra. Elaiza's world seemed to stop. Don Ramon, she whispered in disbelief. You're his son? The heir to the Saavedra fortune? He nodded slowly, his eyes haunted. Yes, and I'm the one who will inherit everything, but I don't know if I'm ready for it. Elaiza's mind was spinning. The man she had married was the heir to a vast fortune, and yet, here he was, unsure of his future. But as the weight of his words settled in, Elaiza couldn't help but wonder, what does this mean for us? The revelation about Alexander's true parentage sent shockwaves through Elaiza's mind. As the heir to Don Ramon Saavedra's fortune, Alexander was thrust into a world of power, wealth, and expectations that neither of them were ready for. The man who had once been a humble construction worker was now expected to inherit one of the wealthiest and most influential families in the country. The weight of this new responsibility was clearly taking its toll on him. Elaiza couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions: relief, confusion, fear, and even anger. They had always dreamed of a better life, but this wasn't what she had imagined. The grand estate, the luxury, the power, none of it seemed to matter if it meant losing the man she loved in the process. As the days passed, Alexander threw himself into the demands of his new life. He spent long hours meeting with lawyers, financial advisors, and business partners. The legacy of the Saavedra family was vast, and the responsibilities that came with it were immense. Alexander was no longer just her husband. He was a figurehead in a world that Elaiza didn't understand. One night, as she waited for him to come home, Elaiza found herself staring out the window, lost in thought. What if this is the end of us? She couldn't bear the thought of losing him, but she also couldn't deny that something had changed. He was no longer the man she married. He was someone else now, someone she wasn't sure she recognized. When Alexander finally returned home, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He looked older, wearier, as if the burden of his newfound legacy was too much for him to bear. Elaiza tried to smile, but the sadness in her heart made it impossible. "How was your day?" she asked softly, trying to keep her voice light. Alexander didn't answer immediately. He took off his jacket and sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. "I don't know, Elaiza. Everything is moving so fast. I'm not sure I'm ready for all of this." Elaiza sat down beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm. "I don't know if I'm ready for it either, but we'll figure it out together. We always have." He looked at her, his expression torn. "I don't want to lose you, Elaiza, but I'm afraid that I'm losing myself in all of this." Elaiza's heart broke. She had always known that Alexander was a man of integrity, but now he was caught between the life he had built with her and the life that his father's legacy demanded of him. "I'm here for you, Alexander," Elaiza whispered. "We'll find a way to make this work. I love you." For the first time in days, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I love you too." As if their already complicated lives weren't enough, the arrival of Melanie back into their world only added more confusion and tension. Elaiza had never expected to see her best friend again, especially not after all that had happened. But Melanie had returned, and with her return came the pain of the past, the pain of the betrayal that Elaiza had never truly healed from. It had been years since Melanie had walked out of Alexander's life, choosing to be with another man who was wealthy and powerful. Elaiza had been there for him through it all, helping him heal from the heartbreak, and eventually, they had found love in each other. But now, with Melanie's reappearance, Elaiza couldn't shake the feeling of unease. One evening, Alexander came home to find Melanie waiting for him in their living room. Elaiza was still in the kitchen when she heard their voices. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone of their conversation was unmistakable. "I've missed you, Alex." Melanie's voice drifted through the door. Elaiza's heart dropped. She didn't need to hear more to know what was happening. Not again, she thought bitterly. Not this time. Elaiza pushed the door open slowly, stepping into the room, where Melanie and Alexander stood. The air was thick with tension. "What's going on here?" Elaiza asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. Alexander looked up at her, his face conflicted. "Elaiza, it's not what you think." But Elaiza wasn't fooled. "Really? Because it sure looks like you're getting close to my best friend again, Alexander." Melanie stood up from the couch, looking at Elaiza with a mixture of guilt and defiance. "I'm sorry, Elaiza. I never meant to hurt you. But the truth is, I've never stopped loving Alex. I always thought we'd find our way back to each other." Elaiza felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. How could she do this to me? She had loved Melanie as a sister, but now she could see that Melanie had always harbored feelings for Alexander, feelings that had never been extinguished. "I think you need to leave," Elaiza said, her voice shaky but determined. "I can't do this anymore." Melanie opened her mouth to protest, but Elaiza raised her hand to silence her. "No, please leave. I need space to think." The next few days were the hardest Elaiza had ever faced. The tension between her and Alexander was palpable, and the emotional strain of everything that had happened weighed heavily on her. She had always known that there was a possibility of Alexander being tempted by Melanie, but she had never expected it to happen when everything seemed so perfect. She had given him her heart, and yet, now it felt as though he had betrayed her. As the days passed, Alexander seemed to grow more distant. He threw himself into his work even more, spending long hours at the Saavedra estate and the business ventures that came with his newfound wealth. Elaiza knew that he was trying to avoid the uncomfortable truths that hung between them, but no amount of work could change what had happened. One evening, as she sat alone in their bedroom, Elaiza's mind raced. She loved Alexander more than anything, but how much was she willing to sacrifice for him? Was love enough to overcome the pain of betrayal? She wasn't sure anymore. Just as she was about to lose herself in her thoughts, she heard the sound of the door opening. Alexander stepped inside, his face weary and conflicted. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice soft but filled with regret. "Elaiza, I don't know how to fix what's broken. I don't know if I can." Elaiza turned to face him, her heart aching with the weight of his words. "I don't know if you can either, Alexander, but I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not." For a moment, there was silence between them, and Elaiza could see the pain in his eyes. She had always known that their love was worth fighting for, but now she wasn't sure if it could survive the weight of all the lies and betrayals. Days had passed since the confrontation with Melanie, and Elaiza was still grappling with the emotions swirling inside her. Her heart ached from the betrayal, not just by Melanie, but by Alexander as well. She had always believed that their love could withstand anything, but now she wasn't sure anymore. The pain of seeing her best friend try to reclaim Alexander was too much to bear. Meanwhile, Alexander was struggling in his own way. He had never expected Melanie to reappear in his life, especially not now when everything seemed to be falling into place. But the truth was, he had always carried feelings for her deep inside, and seeing her again had reignited a flame he thought was long extinguished. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had built a life with Elaiza, one full of love, loyalty, and trust. As the days went by, Alexander found himself retreating into his work even more, spending endless hours at the Saavedra estate. He had become obsessed with the idea of proving himself worthy of the Saavedra legacy. But the further he buried himself in the estate's affairs, the more distant he became from Elaiza. He knew he was hurting her, but he couldn't seem to stop. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Alexander returned home to find Elaiza sitting alone in their bedroom, her back to the door. She hadn't said much to him lately, and the silence between them was deafening. He walked over quietly and sat down beside her. "I know I've been distant, Elaiza," he said, his voice full of regret, "but I need you to understand something. I'm trying to find my place in all of this. I didn't ask for any of this, but it's my responsibility now, and I'm trying to figure it out. I'm trying to be the man I'm supposed to be." Elaiza turned her head slightly, her face still shadowed by the pain she had been feeling. "I understand that you have responsibilities, Alexander," she said softly. "But what about us? What about the life we built together? You've been so focused on this new world, I don't even recognize you anymore." Tears welled up in her eyes as she spoke. "You've changed, Alexander, and I don't know if I can keep up with the person you're becoming." He reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had fallen down her cheek. "I never wanted to change, Elaiza, but I'm lost. I don't know who I am anymore." The rawness in his voice made Elaiza's heart ache. For a moment, she saw the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had always been kind, loving, and full of hope. But that man was slipping away, and Elaiza wasn't sure if she could hold on much longer. "I love you, Alexander," she whispered, "but I can't keep living in this uncertainty. I don't know if you still love me the way you used to." As the weeks passed, Elaiza and Alexander found themselves at a crossroads. The pressure from Alexander's newfound position as the heir to the Saavedra fortune was taking a toll on their relationship. The lifestyle changes, the constant expectations, and the never-ending business deals had created a chasm between them that neither knew how to bridge. Elaiza felt like a stranger in her own home. The grand estate that Alexander now called home was nothing like the small, humble house they had shared in the beginning. The luxury and excess seemed to only remind her of how much she had lost. Alexander was no longer the man she had married. He was becoming someone she couldn't recognize, consumed by the wealth and power that were now his birthright. One evening, as she was walking through the mansion, Elaiza stumbled upon a conversation between Alexander and his stepbrother, Paolo. The tension between them was palpable, and Elaiza couldn't help but overhear snippets of their discussion. "Are you sure she's the one, Alex?" Paolo's voice was smooth, almost calculated. "You don't need to keep dragging that poor woman around. You could have anyone now. You don't need her anymore." Elaiza's heart sank as she heard the words. She knew that Paolo had never liked her, but to hear him speak so coldly about her, about their marriage, made her blood run cold. She had always feared that the wealth and status would change Alexander, but she never imagined it would change him in this way. Without saying a word, Elaiza turned and walked away from the conversation, her heart breaking with every step. Is he right? Does he really not need me anymore? The final blow came when Elaiza found out that Alexander had given Melanie a house. The news spread quickly, and Elaiza couldn't ignore the whispers of betrayal and heartache. She had known that Melanie's return had caused tension in their marriage, but this was a level of betrayal she couldn't stomach. One afternoon, after another long day of work, Elaiza returned home to find Alexander sitting in his study, looking over papers. He looked up as she entered, but his face betrayed no emotion. "Elaiza, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low. She didn't need to hear more. She had already heard enough from the rumors and whispers of others. "So you're giving Melanie a house now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her anger barely contained. Alexander's eyes widened in surprise. "Elaiza, No," she interrupted, holding up her hand. "I don't want to hear it, Alexander. I've heard enough. You've made your choice." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I've given you everything, Alexander. I've stood by you through everything, and this is how you repay me." The words hung in the air between them, a chasm too wide to cross. Elaiza couldn't look at him anymore. She couldn't stand to be in the same room with him, knowing that everything they had built was now crumbling at her feet. "I'm done," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't do this anymore." And with that, Elaiza walked out of the room, out of their home, and into the unknown. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay with him. Not like this. Not when he had chosen Melanie over her. After Elaiza left, Alexander was consumed with regret. The once vibrant and loving woman he had married was now gone, and he was left in the cold, dark mansion that no longer felt like home. He had lost her. He had lost everything. And for what? Power? Money? The world he had once longed for had come at the cost of the one thing that truly mattered, Elaiza. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Alexander couldn't get her out of his mind. He tried to throw himself into the responsibilities of the Saavedra estate, but no matter how many business deals he signed or how much wealth he accumulated, it didn't bring him peace. He missed Elaiza's smile, her warmth, the way she would talk to him about their dreams, their future, the life they had planned together. He had made mistakes. He had listened to others, been swayed by the allure of wealth and status, and in the process, he had pushed the woman he loved away. The thought of losing her forever made his chest tighten, and the fear of never seeing her again made him desperate. "I need to find her," he said to himself one night as he stared out over the estate, his mind racing. "I'll do whatever it takes to bring her back." Alexander used his newfound wealth and resources to search for Elaiza. Private investigators were hired, tracking her every movement. He spared no expense, but Elaiza seemed to have vanished. She was like a ghost, and no one seemed to know where she had gone. The search consumed him. He spent days and nights poring over reports, following leads that always seemed to trail off into nothing. His obsession with finding Elaiza was growing, and his colleagues, friends, and even family began to notice the change in him. The once confident and determined Alexander Saavedra was now a shadow of the man he used to be. But he couldn't give up. He had to find her. He couldn't live with the guilt any longer. Elaiza was the only person who had ever truly loved him, the only person who had seen beyond the Saavedra name, the only one who had never cared about his wealth or status, and he had thrown it all away. It had been 2 years since Elaiza disappeared from his life, and in that time, Alexander had become a shell of himself. The extravagant Saavedra estate felt suffocating. The riches and luxuries around him felt meaningless. Nothing could replace the love he had lost. One day, as Alexander was driving through a quiet part of town, far from the grand estate, he saw a woman walking down the street. She had her head down, her long hair falling over her shoulders, and something about the way she carried herself seemed familiar. His heart skipped a beat as he slowed the car and pulled over. The woman looked up as he approached, and for a moment, Alexander's breath caught in his throat. It was Elaiza. "Elaiza?" he stammered, almost unsure if it was truly her. She looked different, older, more reserved, but it was undoubtedly her. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped out of the car and moved toward her. She stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression guarded. "What are you doing here, Alexander?" she asked quietly, her eyes filled with a mix of surprise and bitterness. "I've been looking for you, Elaiza. I've been searching everywhere," Alexander said, his voice full of emotion. "I've missed you so much. I was wrong, so wrong, to let you go. I was a fool, and I—" "Stop," Elaiza interrupted, her voice cold. "You made your choices, Alexander. You pushed me away. You were so caught up in your new life, your new family, that you didn't even care to notice when I was no longer part of it. I'm not the same person I was back then." Alexander felt a pang in his chest at her words. She was right. He had been blind to her pain, and now it was too late. He had lost her. "Elaiza, please," he begged, stepping closer. "I know I've made mistakes, and I can't undo them, but I love you. I always have, and I'm not the same man I was before. I've changed. I've learned from my mistakes." Elaiza's eyes softened for a moment, but she quickly masked it with indifference. "I've changed too, Alexander. I'm not the same woman you married. I've moved on from you. I've built a life without you, and it's the only life that makes sense for me now." Alexander could feel the weight of her words sinking in. He had hoped that there was still a chance for them, but Elaiza was right. She had moved on. She had found a way to survive without him, and she wasn't the person he once knew. "But I can't forget you," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just give me a chance to make things right." Elaiza looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She could see the pain in his eyes, but she also knew that the man standing before her wasn't the same person who had left her heartbroken. Still, the scars of the past remained. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Alexander," Elaiza said softly, "but I need to figure out who I am, who I've become, and I can't do that while I'm still tied to the past." Without another word, She turned and walked away from him. Alexander stood there, watching her disappear into the distance. His heart shattered as he realized that this time, she was truly gone. Elaiza's decision to walk away was the hardest one she had ever made, but she knew it was the only way for her to heal. She couldn't live in the shadow of her past any longer. She had to move forward, even if it meant leaving Alexander behind. But as the days passed, Elaiza found herself thinking about him constantly. She missed him, his touch, his laugh, the way he made her feel loved. But she couldn't forget the pain he had caused her. She had to remain strong, for herself. Meanwhile, Alexander continued to search for any way to win her back. He had the wealth, the power, and the resources, but none of it mattered without Elaiza by his side. Every day felt like an endless battle, but he couldn't stop fighting. He had one final chance to make things right. He knew that if he didn't take it, he would lose her forever. Would Elaiza give him a second chance, or would their love remain a painful memory of what could have been? The days following the brief encounter between Elaiza and Alexander weighed heavily on both of them. Elaiza returned to her life, keeping her distance from Alexander while trying to heal from the emotional scars that had been inflicted over the years. She had made her peace with walking away, but the ache in her heart didn't quite fade. Meanwhile, Alexander couldn't escape the overwhelming guilt that gnawed at him. His attempt to win Elaiza back had failed, but it had ignited something inside him. For the first time, he realized just how much he had truly loved her, how much she had meant to him. But his efforts to find her and win her back were met with nothing but silence. Elaiza had built a new life for herself, one without him, and Alexander had to respect that, no matter how much it hurt. Days turned into weeks, and while Elaiza did her best to avoid thinking about Alexander, her thoughts would sometimes drift back to him. She couldn't deny that a part of her still loved him, but a stronger part of her was determined to move forward, to not let the past hold her hostage any longer. One evening, while Elaiza was closing the door of her modest apartment, she received a phone call from an unknown number. Hesitantly, she answered. "Elaiza?" The voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Alexander. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she found herself speechless. She hadn't expected to hear from him again. "What do you want, Alexander?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge of defensiveness. "I need to talk to you. I need to explain something," he said urgently. "Please, just hear me out." Elaiza's first instinct was to hang up, but something inside her told her to listen. "I'm listening," she said reluctantly. I found out something," he began. His voice cracked with emotion, and Elaiza could hear the sincerity in it. "I found out that there's more to my father's story than I ever knew. I've learned things about my family, about myself, things that I never imagined." Elaiza's curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" "Don Ramon, my real father. He's not. Don Ramon, my real father. He's not just a wealthy man. He's part of a family with a legacy that I never knew about," Alexander continued. There was a heaviness in his voice that Elaiza had never heard before. Elaiza's mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. "What are you trying to tell me, Alexander?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm telling you that I've discovered who I really am," he said, his words weighing on her. "I'm the rightful heir to a legacy, a fortune, and a position that I never thought I could have. But it's not just about money. It's about family, about understanding who I am, and why my life has turned out this way." Elaiza felt a lump in her throat. The man she had once loved, the man she had married, was not the same person he had been. Alexander had gone from being a humble construction worker to someone who now stood at the precipice of a powerful future, one that was shaped by his true lineage. She stayed silent for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts. "So, what does that have to do with us?" she asked cautiously. Her heart ached, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "Elaiza, I need you to understand," Alexander's voice softened. "I made mistakes and I hurt you, but I didn't know who I was. I didn't understand the responsibility I had. But now, I know what I need to do. I can't undo the past, but I want to make things right. I want to fix what's broken between us." Elaiza's heart beat faster as she considered his words. She had spent so many years burying the pain of his betrayal and the emotional toll it had taken on her. Could she really open herself up again to the possibility of forgiveness? Could she trust him after everything? Before she could respond, Alexander continued, "Elaiza, I've been trying to reach you for months. I need you. I need you in my life. Not just as the woman who used to be my wife, but as the woman who can help me understand this new world, this new life that I'm facing. I can't do it alone." Elaiza swallowed hard. She had always known that Alexander was capable of great things, but she never imagined he would have to go through this transformation. She could hear the vulnerability in his voice now, something she hadn't noticed before. But still, the question remained. Did she want him back? "I don't know, Alexander," Elaiza replied, her voice full of emotion. "You broke my heart, and I don't know if I can trust you again. I've learned to live without you. It's hard to just pretend like everything can go back to how it was." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, Alexander spoke again, his voice filled with determination. "I'm not asking for you to forget, Elaiza. I'm asking for a chance to show you that I've changed, that I'm not the man who hurt you anymore. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope you'll give me a chance." Elaiza sat down on the edge of her bed, feeling a mix of emotions flooding over her. Part of her still longed for the love they once shared, but another part of her felt as though she had moved on. The thought of reopening old wounds was terrifying, but so was the thought of living without closure. "Please, Elaiza," Alexander's voice softened, "give me a chance. We can start over, slowly, but together. I've learned so much about myself, and I want to share that with you." Elaiza closed her eyes, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. After everything they had been through, was she ready to take the risk again? Could she give him a second chance? "I need time," she whispered finally. "I need time to think about everything." "Take all the time you need," Alexander replied. "But please know this. I will be here, waiting for you, when you're ready." With that, the call ended, and Elaiza sat in silence, her thoughts swirling around her. She had to decide if she could truly forgive him, and if she wanted to rebuild the life they had lost. But one thing was clear. The man who had left her so many years ago was no longer the same man who was calling her now. The question was, could she learn to trust him again? The days that followed were a blur for Elaiza. She found herself replaying her conversation with Alexander over and over in her mind, weighing the possibilities. It had been years since they had been together, and so much had changed, not just in their lives, but in the world around them. Alexander had become someone she didn't entirely recognize, someone who now stood on the threshold of an entirely different life. Elaiza's mind was torn between her lingering feelings for him and the fear of being hurt again. She had built a life without him, a life that was simple but hers. She had learned to survive, to live without the man she once loved. But the thought of him coming back into her life stirred something deep inside her, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. As the days passed, Elaiza continued to live her life, working at her job and trying to keep her distance from the emotional turmoil that Alexander had brought with him. But the more time passed, the more she felt the weight of his words pressing on her. Could she really turn her back on the possibility of rekindling what they once had? One day, as she was walking to the local grocery store, Elaiza was stopped by a familiar face. It was Raphael, the private investigator who had first brought news of Alexander's heritage to her doorstep. "Elaiza," Raphael greeted her with a smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to talk to you about something important." Elaiza raised an eyebrow, unsure of what he wanted. "What is it, Raphael?" "I've been in touch with Alexander," Raphael explained, "and I just wanted to say that he's serious about making things right. He's not the same person who left you. And I know this may be hard for you, but I believe he deserves a second chance." Elaiza's heart pounded in her chest. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted. "I've been through so much already." "I understand," Raphael said gently, "but sometimes, Elaiza, The hardest thing is to let go of the past in order to make room for something better." Elaiza stood there, torn between the past and the future. She knew that whatever decision she made would change the course of her life forever. But could she find the strength to trust Alexander again? As the days turned into weeks, Elaiza continued to wrestle with her emotions. She had always believed that love was the most powerful force in the world, but now she wasn't so sure. Her heart was in turmoil, and she didn't know which path to take. One evening, after a long day at work, Elaiza sat down on her couch, staring out the window at the setting sun. She was exhausted, emotionally, physically, and mentally. And then, out of nowhere, she received a message from Alexander. "I'm waiting for you, Elaiza. I won't give up. Please, come back to me." Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the message. This was it, the moment of truth. She could either hold onto the past and let it define her, or she could take a leap of faith and trust that the man Alexander had become was worth the risk. With a deep breath, Elaiza stood up, wiped away her tears, and picked up the phone. She knew what she had to do. "I'm coming, Alexander," she whispered to herself. "Let's see if we can start over." And so, Elaiza made her decision, one that would lead her down a path filled with uncertainty, but also with hope. She was ready to take the chance on love once more. Elaiza's heart pounded as she walked down the familiar road toward Alexander's home. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, and her body was filled with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Every step she took brought her closer to the man who had once been everything to her, and now seemed so different, so changed. She had spent days thinking about her decision, weighing the possibility of forgiveness and what it would mean for her future. Could she truly let go of the pain? Could she rebuild the life they had lost? Or would the wounds from their past keep her from finding peace? But as the distance between her and his home closed, Elaiza realized one thing for certain: she was willing to try. When she finally arrived at the gate of his estate, her breath caught in her throat. The house had been transformed since their last meeting. It was larger, grander, a symbol of the wealth and legacy Alexander had discovered within himself. Her eyes wandered over the lush gardens and the towering structure, the very embodiment of a life she hadn't been sure she was ready for. Taking a deep breath, Elaiza walked up to the door and rang the bell. Her heart raced as the door opened, and there stood Alexander. His expression softened the moment he saw her, and Elaiza could see the emotion welling up in his eyes. "Elaiza," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You came." She nodded, unable to find her words. She was overwhelmed by the sight of him, different yet the same, the man she had loved so deeply. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Of course," Alexander replied, stepping aside to let her in. "I've waited for this moment for so long. I've been waiting for you." Elaiza entered the house, her footsteps uncertain but determined. She followed him to the living room, where they both sat in silence for a long moment. The atmosphere between them was thick with unspoken words, emotions neither of them was fully ready to confront. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "Elaiza, I don't expect you to forgive me easily. I've hurt you, and I can't take that back. But I want you to know that everything I've done, every mistake, has made me realize how much I need you, how much I love you." Elaiza looked at him, her heart aching. "How can I believe you, Alexander? How can I trust you after everything you've done?" "I know it won't be easy," he said softly, his gaze filled with regret. "But I've learned so much about myself, about the man I was before and the man I want to be now. You were always the one who made me feel whole, Elaiza. I was lost without you." Her eyes softened, and for the first time in years, Elaiza allowed herself to feel the weight of his words. She still loved him, despite the hurt and betrayal. The connection they had once shared was undeniable, and though it was broken, a part of her wanted to believe that it could be mended. "I don't know if I can forgive you right away," Elaiza said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to try, Alexander. I'm willing to see if we can rebuild what we lost." Alexander's eyes shone with hope, and he took her hand gently in his. "I'll wait for you. I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm worthy of your love." Elaiza's heart swelled as she looked into his eyes. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. It wouldn't be easy, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for them. A chance to rebuild, to love again. And so, they began their journey together. A journey that would take time, patience, and understanding. But they were willing to take that first step toward healing, together. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Alexander and Elaiza worked tirelessly to rebuild the foundation of their relationship, brick by brick. They faced challenges, of course, old wounds, lingering doubts, and fears that crept in when they least expected them. But slowly, they began to heal. Slowly, they found themselves learning to trust each other again. Alexander, with all his wealth and power, was a different man now. The money, the title, and the responsibility that came with his family's legacy no longer held the same appeal to him. What mattered most was Elaiza, the woman who had always seen him for who he truly was, not the heir to a fortune, but just Alexander, the man she had loved. Elaiza, on the other hand, was learning to open her heart again. It wasn't easy, but with each passing day, she found herself falling in love with him all over again. She saw the changes he had made, the effort he was putting in, and the sincerity in his eyes. She was learning to trust him, to let go of the past, and to embrace the future they were building together. One evening, after a long day of work, Alexander and Elaiza sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset. The air was warm, the sky painted in shades of gold and orange, and for the first time in a long while, Elaiza felt at peace. "I never thought we'd be here, together again," Elaiza said softly, leaning her head on Alexander's shoulder. "Neither did I," Alexander replied, his voice full of gratitude. "But we made it. We're here, and I'm never letting you go." Elaiza smiled, her heart light. "I never thought I'd trust you again, but here we are, and I'm glad we're here." Alexander squeezed her hand gently. "We've been through a lot, Elaiza, but together, we can face anything." And with that, they sat in silence, watching the last rays of the sun dip below the horizon. Their future was uncertain, but they knew one thing for sure. They had each other, and that was enough. Together, they would build a life, one filled with love, understanding, and the hope that no matter what the future held, they could face it together. The dawn of a new chapter in their lives had begun. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.